Hi everyone, welcome to the Dyl Pickle Movie Network. I am Dylan Randazzo. Today is the day that Avatar: The Way of Water finally makes its way onto Disney Plus. So I thought this was a perfect time to rank all of the James Cameron movies, and I'm not just talking about all the big ones. I'm talking about some of the smaller ones as well. In fact, I'm talking about every single film he's ever made, from documentary to short film to big, monumental, groundbreaking money makers. We're talking about it all. There are 13 films on this list that we're going to get to, but I did want to say this is my first director ranking video here on the channel. So if you do like videos like these, make sure to leave a like down below, comment below what other directors you might want to see me rank in the future, and leave your rankings too, because my ranking is just my ranking. It's not anyone else's ranking. It might be someone else's ranking, but it's not the set definitive ranking, especially with a filmmaker like James Cameron. There are so many classics to get to, so let's get straight into it. At number 13 is Piranha 2: The Spawning. This is not James Cameron's first film, but it is his first feature-length film. Piranha 2 has a weird kind of story to it, in the fact that James Cameron since then has kind of disowned this film and said, well, no, Terminator was my first. This wasn't my first. But he is the credited director here. But you can definitely see exactly when James Cameron was full hands-on in this film and when he wasn't. And the stuff that he's most hands-on in is the most impressive stuff in this film. That is very seldom seen. This film doesn't have a lot of great high points. The highest points come from some of the underwater shooting. I think there's some really interesting use of underwater effects, or at least underwater cinematography, that kind of spawns this whole trend in Cameron's filmography, this obsession with the ocean and undersea. And this is kind of the origin of that, but in a very amateurish, very early onset way. I think he would only get better from this film for sure, but it is the worst only because he doesn't have his full definitive stamp on the whole thing. It's very clear that there are some moments where it is studio overridden. It's a bad movie, but it's not the kind of bad movie that I enjoy watching because it's bad. Stuff we cover on the show Framewreck, me and Matt Chapman. It's not like that. It's not one of those movies, at least not to me. I just found it a bit of a slog and definitely the weakest in what is otherwise a rather strong filmography. At number 12, we actually have a TV documentary that James Cameron co-directed with Gary Johnstone titled Expedition Bismarck. This is a documentary about the survivors of a German ship, the Bismarck, that sank during World War II. And he kind of talks to some of the survivors of the ship, some of the crew, as well as some research analysts, and kind of just explores this whole crash site and all the obviously tragedy that happened, but also kind of examining some of the roots of the war. The reason why this ranks lower, for two reasons. A, it doesn't have that James Cameron flair visually. Obviously, this is a TV movie, so the budget's way lower, but even in some of his other lower budget films, there's still some sort of magic he's making, whereas in this film, it just feels very low budget. It feels like it's made for TV. And the other reason I don't love it too much is because this is centered around a Nazi ship, and for most of the film, he's talking to surviving Nazis who survived the war, which is a little weird to watch, to watch him like converse with these Nazis and not want to like punch them in the face. And maybe he wanted to, hurt them, but you don't necessarily get that vibe all the time. There's just, I think, a little too much negligence to the actual matter of the fact that this was a Nazi ship. And I wish they kind of dove even more into the fact that this was used as a harmful vessel. They focus a little bit too much on the beauty of the architecture and the mechanics of the ship and how it's such a travesty that such a beautiful piece of machinery died. And I get that from a preservationist angle and from someone who's obsessed with the Titanic, the idea of this art kind of gone to waste. A film, The Wind Rises, a Studio Ghibli film, kind of deals with similar subject matters, and the fact that, this one character designs airplanes that are made for war and that kind of conflict of interest. And in this sense, I wish there was a little bit more conflict and talk about the Nazism and Hitler over the beauty of the ship itself. And I think it focuses too much on the forgone treasure of the ship and not enough on the danger of the ship. At number 11, we have Xenogenesis. And this is probably the one where all of you were like, Xeno what? What a Genesis? What is this film? And I said the same thing. But it is a credited film by James Cameron. It is his first film. It is a short film that came out in 1978. So get this, a year after Star Wars came out, James Cameron brought to life this 12-minute short about this man and this woman, this engineering couple or whatever, that go into this giant starship to search for a place to start a new life cycle. And they come across this giant robot cleaner, essentially this giant Wally, if you will, and he ends up being a destructive robot, and there's combat that ensues, and this whole don't trust the machines type thing, this whole conversation of technology. Listen, this film is not good. It's not well shot. It's not well rendered. It's not well preserved. And, that I'm going to take with a grain of salt because I did watch this on the only available outlet I could, which was YouTube. So maybe in its original form it was a little bit nicer to look at in its original raw form, but I still think, despite the fact that it's severely dated, I just think it's so cool to see a filmmaker back in the 70s knowing what he would go on to accomplish, seeing him at his origin and seeing the little hints of things that we would see. It's kind of like Piranha 2. I don't like that film at all, but I saw little tiny little indicators of what James Cameron would become. And that's why movies like this are always fun to watch. It's not something I'll ever watch again. It's not something I would necessarily recommend to anyone, but it's something that is charming because of what we know about James Cameron and how we've seen his career evolve since. At number 10, we have a documentary titled Aliens of the Deep. Now, James Cameron, I already talked about an underwater documentary. Later on, I'm going to talk about another underwater documentary. There are a lot of underwater documentaries he makes, and a lot of the time I would just dismiss it as a way to fund a bigger movie. And in this case, yeah, there's a really good likelihood that he made these documentaries to fund Avatar, to basically pay for this giant passion project he had, along with his Titanic money. But I think there's actually some artistic merit in his documentaries, even if, like I said, with Expedition Bismarck, I don't love a lot of the subject matter there. And in here, I find it a little boring. I still think it's well made. I think it's well shot. I think there's some gorgeous visuals in this thing as it explores this underwater sea life. A lot of cool sea life and animals that you get to see and come across in this film. It's just not necessarily my cup of tea, only because I can only watch something like this for so long. I would put on Planet Earth documentaries and stuff to go to sleep when I was younger because it was calming, it was relaxing, but it was never really engaging me in a way that I needed to stay up and watch it. And a lot of James Cameron's films are like that, where I can put it on and just stay wide awake. I can't go to sleep, whereas this is one where I could easily put it on to go to sleep. And that's why I think it ranks a little bit lower, but it does crack the top 10. So good for you, Aliens of the Deep. You are not the worst of James Cameron's underwater documentaries. You're not the best, but you are a top 10 James Cameron film. At number 9, we have True Lies. This may be the first shocker of the list because I know a lot of people are very fond of True Lies, but I had only just seen this last week before recording this. So I'm looking at it at a very fresh lens, a very modern lens, and I definitely see how, if you have the nostalgia for this film, you probably really enjoy it. And I do enjoy a lot of aspects of it. First off, Jamie Lee Curtis is phenomenal in this film. For anyone who's like, how does this lady have an Oscar? Go watch Halloween, go watch this film, and tell me she's not a great actress. I get it. Her part was small in Everything Everywhere All at Once, but she's a great actress, and I think this proves it. I think some of the biggest issues with True Lies, there's a few things. One, I don't think James Cameron has ever been strongest in dialogue and comedy. I think there are comedic bits in all his other films. I think there are really solid moments of dialogue in his other films. I always thought of James Cameron as more of a visual storyteller, someone who focuses on world building and tones and vibes and building and falling actions, but this is a film that's more rooted in plot and character and dialogue and comedy, and a lot of that comedy and dialogue and character interaction, it just feels so dated nowadays, especially the way they talk about women in this film, the way they discuss other races in this film. It gets a little, it pushes it. And normally, I like to look at something from the lens of when it was made. But I still think, I have to judge it based on who I am in the moment. And I found some moments to be a little bit problematic, especially there's a scene where it's meant to be played as kind of the silly scene where Jamie Lee Curtis is stripping for Arnold Schwarzenegger, but then they also start kissing and it's supposed to be kind of emotional and passionate and romantic. But then the whole time he's trying to pretend he's someone else and has her close her eyes so she doesn't know it's him kissing her. I don't know. There's a lot of weird things like that. I just think there are moments that could have been a little bit more ironed out, a little bit more thought out in the way it just kind of treated relationships and treated interactions with women. But I will say it is interesting to see James Cameron make a film that deals a lot with a couple who has a strained relationship when he kind of has made a lot of these films through the wake or rise or fall of a marriage. In this sense, I believe this is right after his divorce from Catherine Bigelow. So you can definitely sense that there is a purpose for the story that James Cameron wants to tell. I just think some of the language that some of the characters use in talking about the women in this film doesn't necessarily help the case. I also think this has a problem with a lot of action films where the movie almost seems to end, and then at the very end, a character runs in and says, wait, but there's one more thing you have to go do. And I will say True Lies has some amazing action sequences to where I totally understand why they tacked on an extra 20 minutes to have him save his daughter. But at the same time, how much more of this story do we need to tell when it seemed like the story was completely wrapped up with a bow, nice and perfect. It resolved this arc between Arnie and Jamie Lee Curtis's character to where we had this extra added kind of a act four. It doesn't even feel like an act three. It feels like an act four where the movie's done and they just needed to add something. And that's something that he does with a few other films of his as well. And I think that's just his overindulgence and him loving everything he does so much to where he doesn't want to cut any of it. He wants to relish in these worlds he creates. The only difference is that True Lies doesn't have that otherworldly quality to it. It feels very grounded in reality. So that's also why I think some of the dialogue and interactions stick out even more as a little bit problematic because it's set in a very realistic world. And I know I just talked about how realistic this film presents itself to be, but you cannot sell me on a concept where Arnold Schwarzenegger, of all people, this anomaly, this person who is instantly recognizable, whether you've seen one Arnie film or 20, you know Arnie, you know his voice, you know his stature. He's playing this guy who's just supposed to be an everyman. You know, when he's revealed to be a spy, Jamie Lee Curtis's character is like, him? No, my husband, he's a nobody. He's just a Joe Schmo. He works in computers. You're telling me that she didn't have any inkling that Arnold Schwarzenegger maybe didn't work in computers, or at least comes to find it to be a little bit of a surprise when he does. Like, if I found out that Arnold Schwarzenegger, my partner, was really a secret agent spy, I'd be like, oh, that makes a lot of sense, given who Arnold is. So I just think also his casting, as good as he is, as charismatic as he is, I just don't know if Arnold was the right fit for this story, considering a lot of the story falls on the shoulders of an idea where the character is able to kind of camouflage and chameleon himself in these different scenarios. And Arnold is someone who is the opposite of a chameleon. He stands out. And that's what makes some other films that we're about to talk about so much better, is because of who Arnold is and his presence and his gravitas. But in this film, I think you could have gotten an actor who could still do the action, but could also sell the everyman, just works in computers and the spy stuff without being so obvious on either end. So I definitely think there are some issues here, but like I said, the action set pieces are good. The horse moment is amazing. Like, there are good moments here, and I still find it enjoyable, even if I think it's severely flawed. Moving on to number 8, we have the final of the 3 documentaries we're going to be talking about. We have Ghosts of the Abyss. This is a film where it started and I was like, all right, do we really need to see another film where James Cameron goes down to the depths of the Titanic? What else does he have to say here? And I think for a lot of the majority of the film, he really doesn't add a ton new to what we've already learned in the film Titanic, because a lot of Titanic, a lot of the framing device is that they are searching through the remains of the Titanic, and that's how they come across the drawing, and that's how they get in contact with Rose. And I think, this film is just kind of more of the same of that, of going through all the artifacts and going through deeper into that Titanic. And if you're into the Titanic and you're into the history of it, if you weren't swept up in the Leo and Kate Winslet romance, then this might be the film for you, because it deals with the history of it and the actual structure of the Titanic. And it's exploring a vessel that is truly beautiful, that is not tied to any Nazism like Expedition Bismarck is, to where you don't feel guilty looking at the ship and going, wow, how beautiful. You can actually look at this film and say, wow, how beautiful, and how sad that this is gone. The reason, though, why this ranks so high is because up until the end, I thought it was a good, competent documentary about stuff I already kind of knew about. But then at the very end, there's a shot where, after they successfully explore one part of the Titanic, one of the divers turns to the camera and says, 6 a.m., September 11th, 2001. And in that moment, my heart sank and my stomach kind of churned a little bit, because in the moment, these divers are coming across a huge breakthrough in their careers, and it is literally 3 hours before the tragic incidents that would happen in New York on September 11, 2001, to where the very next shot is James Cameron and the crew getting out of the water for Bill Paxton and the rest of the crew to basically inform them of what happened with the terrorist attacks. And it's one of these real life moments that it's so crazy that they captured this on film, because I think everyone has their own story of where they were and what they remember from that day. And to see that these guys had literally just triumphed on exploring this kind of eighth wonder of the world, only to come up above the surface and find out that their world has essentially been changed forever. I mean, it's really one of these like crazy plot twists that cannot even be scripted. It's real life, and I think that's what makes it even more harrowing and even more jarring. So I would recommend Ghost of the Abyss only for like that last 20 minutes where you can see kind of the commentary on how they take the tragedy of the Titanic and compare it with the tragedy of 9/11, and how it almost kind of makes a thematic thesis statement for this film that wasn't really present before. Earlier, it was just, oh, let's look at all the cool things that the ship had underwater. Let's discover something we've never seen before. And at the end, it becomes this larger statement on tragedy and mass tragedy and how a nation kind of overcomes that or doesn't overcome that and the ghosts that live with that. It really is a harrowing ending to a documentary I thought was otherwise fine, but is elevated by that last act alone. At number seven, we have The Abyss. Now, The Abyss is a story that tackles a lot. There's a central plot line about this man and this woman trying to reconnect after a divorce, a separation. Again, kind of tying into what I talked about with True Lies. This movie is coming off of the divorce with Gail Ann Hurd. So again, you can kind of see Cameron kind of working through his own marital issues through this film. And I love when filmmakers use film as a therapy for their own self and kind of a reflection of their own work and kind of what they've been going through. Martin Scorsese does that a lot. He'll make films that feel very timely to where he is at his own journey as a filmmaker and his own philosophies, his own life. But it also is so packed with so much sci-fi. There's some action in there. There's some very heady concepts. There's some very emotional, almost melodramatic moments. And I know sometimes they're at odds with one another. Sometimes some stretches of the film feel a little long, but I think it all comes together in a really satisfying whole. This is really kind of one of the fundamental pieces of his filmography, despite it being a box office bomb and not really getting too much appraise. You know, it didn't get a big home release. There's some weird ins and outs about the Blu-ray that has never come out but is planning on coming out or something. But it's really interesting to see kind of this marriage of all the things James Cameron does, from his commentary on his own relationships to his exploration of science to his love of water. I mean, we really get literally every ounce of his kind of psyche in this film. And while I don't necessarily think it's all juggled perfectly, like I think a few of the balls are dropped when they're being juggled, I still think it's a satisfying product. And it's really great to see this as a stepping stone to what would later be Titanic and Terminator and Avatar, these things that even further enhance the little seeds that were planted here. I just really like this film. I don't love it, but I just think it's a solid film. At number six, we have Aliens. This might be a little controversial too, but now we're getting into the territory where every movie here I really like to love to some degree, like to love. I really don't have many issues with Aliens. The only fact of the matter is that I just prefer Alien, and I like the almost horror sci-fi vibe more than I like the action vibe, which is a little weird because a lot of the action we see in Aliens is kind of replicated in Terminator 2 and Avatar, some of the style of the action. But for some reason, I've always just been more drawn to the journey that Ripley has taken in the first Alien than I am this one. And I don't even count the other sequels in terms of diminishing the value of this one. For some, I think they think Alien 3 diminishes the quality of Aliens. I don't really think that. I think, if anything, it makes us appreciate Aliens even more because Alien 3 wasn't as successful, even though I'm not the biggest hater of Alien 3 either. I just think that first film is so good to where I personally would always go back to watch it, but I don't think that's a negative about this film either. I think this film has a lot of great moments, especially with the characterization of Ripley. I love how it's a strong woman in the lead. You get this really great motherly kind of bond with Newt. I will say I've never seen the director's cut, but I heard the director's cut is even better. So honestly, I might want to watch the director's cut because I think the director's cut could push Aliens a few slots even higher on this list. I think the director's cut, from what I've heard, has some major elements, especially with the characters and relationships, and especially Ripley and her past and her background, that are kind of fundamental things that you'd think would make the final cut, but are probably trimmed out in favor of more action, more spectacle. And I'm just more into the story stuff than I am the spectacle stuff in this sense, in the Alien franchise, because I'm so into all the conceptual stuff with Alien. But it really is a solid film. I mean, it's a really solid action film. I wouldn't begrudge anyone who thinks Aliens is better than Alien. It's the age-old debate, but I think both films are great in their own right. Moving on to number five, we have the original The Terminator. And I say the original because this is what James Cameron claims to be his first feature film, even though some would say it is still Piranha 2. But The Terminator is like the first movie that announces James Cameron to the world to say, hey, this guy is making movies and you better pay attention. And while I was watching this, I was expecting the action James Cameron, the very big spectacle-driven James Cameron work, and I had to take a step back and remember that the reason the more recent films are so spectacle driven is because he has the budget. Whereas here in The Terminator, he didn't have that budget. He's working with very little, yet I think he uses the very little budget in such a unique way. Instead of setting something in the future, he brings something futuristic to the present. So where he doesn't have to necessarily make things feel otherworldly, he only needs to add some otherworldly elements into our own familiar world. And I really like that device. It's something we see in other films too. I mean, Looper is a film that came to mind where, it kind of explores this idea of the future coming to meet the present to fix the future when there's something that's going to happen in the future that they need to prevent by going back. It's the exact kind of idea, but I think the Terminator, it only goes to show how influential it is that it is spanning so many different ideas and concepts for films. But what I was kind of saying earlier is that I expected this to be an action film. I expected this to be big and loud and spectacle driven, but really, essentially it's a horror film. It's a slasher film. It's this villain who is going around stalking these different Sarah Connors that he's picking off through the phone book until he finds the one he needs. And then when he finds the one he needs, it's him chasing her. It's like the boogeyman. It's Michael Myers and Laurie Strode. It's essentially Sarah Connor is her own final girl. Like, she is one of the essential final girls because she gets out of this, but it's a really tense cat and mouse chase this whole time. And Arnold's presence in this film, like I said with True Lies, I think Arnold is such an individual presence, such a stoic presence, that in True Lies it almost feels that that role needs a little bit more fluidity, whereas here I think he fits the role perfectly to where I couldn't see anyone else playing this role. So while I think the sequel is better, spoiler alert, I haven't talked about it yet, I still think this film is so key, especially for James Cameron's filmography, but of course for the action genre, or I guess if you want to call it action, more so for the sci-fi genre as a whole, I guess, because this isn't really an action film. Like I said, it's a horror film, but just for this type of film and this era of filmmaking, this is such an influential film, and it's one that I honestly am more excited to rewatch because I think there's a little bit more nuance even than some of the other films that I even have above it. Like, I really am so excited to rewatch this because I've only seen it once and I was definitely blown away. I expected to like it, but not love it because everyone talks about how good the second one is, but I really did love this film. Moving on to number 4, we have Avatar: The Way of Water. It's so recent, so it's like, do I want to put it all the way in the top 3? I don't know. I need to sit on it a little bit longer because the first time I saw this, I was like, yep, best movie of Cameron's career. And then I was like, wait, okay, I need to chill. I need to take a breath. Second time I saw it, I was like, this is really good. But I think a lot of the excitement from the first time is that we hadn't been in Pandora in so long. And then the third time I watched it, I started to see a few more of the flaws. But the flaws aren't that big to where I'm ready to write it off as a failure or anything. I mean, it's in the top 4 of this incredible filmmaker's filmography. And I think it's a really great film. I mean, I think the visuals, from a sheer visual standpoint, I mean, this is the biggest budget I think that he's ever been given, if not the second, and he totally delivers on it. Everything about this new world with all the water, this other side of Pandora we've never seen before, is so stunning. But just the character animation is still so crisp. All the lighting is so perfect. There's so many CGI movies out there now that just don't understand how to light their characters properly when it's not actual lighting, when they're using so much CGI. And here, I think he understands how to use his actors on set to get a real effect, but also when he puts all the CGI on top of it, still making it feel real in that world. Obviously, it feels otherworldly because we're not used to blue people walking around, but it still feels in this world real. Nothing feels artificial in this specific world, especially because we're not getting the whole, oh, we're jumping into pods and now we're Navi and now we're human, now we're Navi, like the first one did. What I do like, especially in this film, is the family dynamic and the fact that we get these kids to bounce off of. We get Jake Sully in a more interesting position where he has to be a father, but also still try to step up as a leader. And I think it just takes his character and the family in general into an interesting new height. But what I will say is one of the flaws of this film is I think Neytiri gets a little bit of a backseat. She has moments in this thing that are great, but I wanted a lot more of Neytiri because she is my favorite part of the first one. We're about to talk about the first one, but I just wish they had done a little bit more with Neytiri's arc. I think they're going to develop it more, especially with the spider dynamic. I just really wanted them to do a little bit more with Neytiri and Jake because the first one was essentially a romance, and in this one it's such a family story that we get very little moments of Jake and Neytiri just having moments for themselves, and I kind of wish we had a little bit more of that. And then of course just the idea of having to bring everyone back and try to create these plot devices to where we can still have Stephen Lang and Sigourney Weaver in the universe. And I will say, despite it being a little weird to grasp at first, the fact that Sigourney Weaver's playing a teenager and Quaritch is back in this Avatar body, even though he hated the Na'vi, all these things, I still think James Cameron makes it make sense. He's very clever in how he integrates this world. It doesn't feel like one of those retcons, like some films do, where it's like, oh no, they actually survived. Instead, he's acknowledging that these characters died. They're just coming back in a new way, in a new form. And I think it plays into the overall spirituality of these Pandora centered Avatar movies. The idea of Awa and the spirit and this connectivity, and we are one with the earth and all that stuff. I think it makes a lot of sense for some of these characters to be recycled into newer Avatar bodies and Navi bodies. I really do like how he expands this world even more. And it is such a feast for the eyes. Like I said, I love the moments, especially with the Tulkun, with the whales, some of the best whales of last year. And last year had a lot of whales. Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, The Whale, Chippendale Rescue Rangers had a whole song about a whale. Like Pinocchio, we had like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 Pinocchio movies. Like we had a lot of whales last year, but this one I think was the best of all the whales we saw. Moving on to number 3, we have the original Avatar. This one and the sequel are kind of they're essentially tied because I love them both so much. The only reason I prefer the original Avatar is because I think the story itself is just a little bit more streamlined. The second film, it kind of builds the world out so much, but by adding so many different layers, it feels a little overstuffed at times, whereas this film just feels a little bit more concise. We're only following Jake and Neytiri, and in that, we're able to focus on this really beautiful relationship that happens. And I know the criticisms, obviously, of the fact that it's this white guy coming into this world of Na'vi and trying to basically save them, this white savior idea. But I think it's just looking at it and watching it over and over again, I can see that criticism, but I also think there's essentially an idea where he needs saving too, and Neytiri essentially saves him. I think a lot of this film is about Jake learning to not just be a better warrior, but be a better person and kind of grow and eventually get to this status where he can lead this group, but I don't think he can lead them without Neytiri. So yes, he eventually saves this group. It is the white savior thing, but she saves him first. And I think because of that, I think Neytiri's arc is so strong. Like I said, my one problem with The Way of Water was there was not enough Neytiri, because this film gives us so much Neytiri, and Zoe Saldana is so good in this role, and I love this character. I love the bond and the relationship, and I know the director's cut takes it to maybe some unnecessary lengths, if you know what I mean, in terms of their relationship, but I really do think every moment between the two of them, I'm just so drawn in by it. So I think it just comes down to personal preference. I mean, this was the film that introduced me to Pandora when I was only 11 years old. So I'm looking at this as a perspective of an 11-year-old who sat in that theater and watched Pandora unfold before my eyes. And I just don't think you can top that. Even though the sequel got really close and made me feel that sense of awe, the first film, I'll never be able to capture that magic in terms of seeing that. The closest I'll get is honestly probably Disney World, where it's actually in front of you and you can actually touch these mountains. But I still think these films, the Pandora Avatar films, are just so impressive, especially stylistically. Yeah, people might say it's Pocahontas, may say it's Ferngully, but do Ferngully and Pocahontas have giant robots fighting aliens? I don't think so. At number 2, we have T2, Terminator 2 Judgment Day. This is a sequel I've only seen once, but I wish I had been watching it once a year, because this is a film I could see myself watching once a year. It's one of those like instant classics. I am instantly adding it to the rotation. I love it so much. It is so good. It takes everything that was great about the Terminator and expands on it, but not retreading the same story. And I think that's such a clever way of changing up a story and making the person who was the villain, the scary Michael Myers-esque stalker in the first film, the hero of the second film. And they do it again in such a natural way. James Cameron has such a power to just kind of take a character and change them while also making it make sense within the story. Like I just talked about with Quaritch and with Sigourney Weaver's characters in Avatar, he does a good job in making Arnold, who was at once a villain, now a hero, and through very subtle changes, just by the idea that, John Connor will say something and he has to follow his demand, to where he says, don't kill. And then the new Terminator, the new Arnold Schwarzenegger character says, okay, I won't kill, and then shoots him in the kneecaps because it's not killing, things like that, where, subtle variations to the character and, subtly giving him these like slogans and phrases that a kid would say that he then says in his Arnie way that comes across really funny. And that's the difference between this and True Lies. And I hate to keep comparing it with True Lies, because I know a lot of people love True Lies, but True Lies, it's a script written with funny jokes. Here, none of the dialogue is necessarily funny, but because Arnold is playing it so straight and delivering them as if they were dramatic, it makes it funny because this character is saying it in this moment. It's circumstantial comedy that I think works a lot better than Arnold reading punchlines off a page in True Lies. I think this film kind of understands who Arnold is better and his versatility as a performer, or lack thereof of versatility. But I think that's what makes Arnold so special as a performer, is the fact that he is kind of one note, and they really play into that in this film and the last Terminator film, the fact that he only kind of has one personality. So when he does kind of make little subtle alterations, they're really powerful and really impactful. And I just love the whole story here. I love Sarah Connor's arc, how she's kind of gotten this edge to her to where she then just becomes this really strong, empowering character. Because the first one, she's, running for her life, she's fearing for her life. Here we get a little bit more of her as an individual, kind of sticking up and standing up for herself, despite the trauma she goes through in the first half of this thing as she's recovering from the events of the last film and she's in that psych ward. I just think it's such a perfectly plotted film. Everything makes sense. There's not a moment wasted. I think the villain is absolutely incredible, especially the CGI at the time and even now. I think the CGI has held up really well. It's stuff we've seen a little bit of in The Abyss, little shades of that kind of like metallic liquid like figure substance, and I think they go full-fledged with the effects here in T2. It's just a film I could rave on and on and on about, but I think it's successful in that it still respects what the original set forth, but it uses the budget to kind of propel it into a new direction, which I really appreciate. And this is, like I said, going to be in the instant rotation of a film that I probably will watch every year for the next however many years I'm on this planet, and a film that I wish I had been watching for the last 10, 15, 20 years already. And it's a shame I've waited 25 years of my life to actually get to it. But at number one, it's Titanic. Now, like I said, Avatar was my first experience with James Cameron, getting Pandora, seeing Pandora on the screen and being in awe with it. But Titanic, I think, is the first time I actually noticed James Cameron as a filmmaker, as this really impressive blockbuster spectacle filmmaker. Honestly, I watched this film and I turned it on TV one day. It had just hit the iceberg. The Titanic had just hit the iceberg. So I saw the second half. I watched this film without watching the whole first half of the romance, just watching that ending. And it's some of the best disaster horror filmmaking I've ever seen. Incredibly sad and incredibly traumatic, but so incredibly crafted to where you don't know what CGI and what is practical. You don't know if these actors are actually cold or not, or if they're just acting. They probably are cold, which is a little bit problematic. But again, we're only seeing what is presented to us on screen. And it's just so amazing how he's able to do this. And then I go back and I watch the first half and I'm like, there's a whole movie before this setting up one of the most epic romances in all of cinema as well, to where you can enjoy the second half for the actual action of it and the staging of it and how it's designed. But then when you watch it with the first half, it makes it even more powerful because the first half is establishing the stakes, and the stakes could not be higher. This beautiful star-crossed romance of this girl who can't be with this guy despite the fact that they are in love, but they come from different classes, and she gets to dance with him in his environment. He is eating with her, trying to impress her in hers. And I could go on and on about how good this film is. Maybe I should do a commentary someday on Titanic, because I just think every ounce of this film has something interesting to say about it, whether it be a design standpoint, whether it be a story standpoint, whether it be something to do with some comedy. There's some genuine comedy here. I mean, Billy Zane's character, some people say it's a bad performance. I say it's a hammy performance, and that's what makes it good, because he's hamming it up. And who doesn't love to see Billy Zane go cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs in this movie? I love it. I put the diamond in the coat. I put the coat on her. All that stuff. It's so good. It's so good. And I just wish I had seen this earlier. Again, like I saw this when I was maybe like 13, 14, but I wish I had seen this earlier. And I know there are boobs and stuff like that to where a lot of kids weren't able to watch it when they were younger. But films like these are movies you wish you had seen a million more times than you already have. You wish you could just live with forever and ever and ever. And it's, a testament to a film like this, because it is a tragedy essentially, but I still feel like I could live with these characters and live in this environment for so long and just watch this for hours and hours and hours, despite how heartbreaking it is, because everything is just so well directed. I do think this is a really well written script. Everything's so well acted. Even the bit roles, Gloria Stewart as the older Rose, I love that as a framing device for this film. I love Bill Paxton as kind of that audience eye into the story as well. I love, obviously, Leo and Kate Winslet. I mean, these are really monumental performances in their careers, and they're incredible. But also, like I said, Billy Zane, but also Victor Garber is incredible in his small role. I really think everyone, Kathy Bates, I mean, they keep coming to my mind because there's so much to love about this film, so much to say. And if I had every minute to say what I love about it, we would be here as long as the film is for 3 hours talking about it. But it is my favorite James Cameron film. It's the one that made me fall in love with James Cameron films. It's the one that made me take notice of James Cameron and really want to explore more of his films, which I admittedly didn't get around to all of them until recently, but I really do think it is the crowning achievement of a great filmmaker who's made some great other films. And I think the one thing that Titanic has that all the other films don't really, except for maybe True Lies, but True Lies has other issues, is that every other film, despite some of it feeling familiar, there are otherworldly things. Avatar takes place on another planet. Terminator 2, it deals with these big robots. Aliens, self-explanatory. The Abyss. Here, it's real life, and I think that's what makes it even more harrowing. It just builds a bigger connection with the audience because this film, I think, can like speak to audiences' hearts a little bit more directly because it is showing us images that we're used to. I mean, the idea of class, we see this in a lot of films, but there are recognizable images for upper, middle, and lower class in this film that I think people can relate to. And you can kind of tap into your own brain and say, well, where would I fit in here? Would I survive? What would my next move be? It feels so much realer and more urgent than a lot of the other films. I mean, Avatar, it's amazing. It's got some great conflict, but it is this escapist film because it takes place on another planet. It's escapism, and to a degree, so are the Terminator films. But this isn't escapism. This is real life, and I think that only kind of enhances the stakes and enhances the personal connection there, and makes it, I think, his crowning achievement, which is tough to say because he has so many, but I think this film is his crowning achievement. I love it so much. It's my sister's favorite film. It's one of my favorite films. I know a lot of people who have it in their top 10s, top fives, and I know it's kind of gotten a little flack just because when a film becomes the highest grossing of all time, there's going to be a lot of eyes on it. It's a pedestal thing. It happens with Best Picture too, and this film also won Best Picture, which again, double the eyes, double the pedestal, double the pressure for a film to have. But I think it delivers, and I think there's a reason it became the highest grossing is because people saw it, they loved it, they wanted to see it again, they wanted to bring their boyfriends, their girlfriends, their partners, their lovers, their everyone, their kids, their parents. They wanted to bring everyone to the movies, and this is a movie that if anyone hasn't seen it, I tell immediately, I'm like, go watch it, it's amazing. But also, it's one that even if someone's seen it, I'll be like, you want to watch it again? Because it's just one of those films that you can watch time and time again. It's so, so amazing. So that is my ranking of all the James Cameron films. If you want to see me go in depth with any of these films, I will tell you right now, we will be covering Titanic on an episode of Picture This in the future. And we did cover an episode on 2009. So Avatar is talked about at length in our 2009 picture of this episode. And Avatar: The Way of Water is talked about in length for our 2022 episode as well. So if you want to see elongated conversations about those three films, Titanic, you'll have to wait some time. But Avatar and Avatar: The Way of Water, there's a full dissertation on those films in that video, in those Picture This videos. And there it is. There's my final ranking one more time. I just wanted to thank all of you for watching. If you liked this whole format, if you like me talking about these directors' careers in general and ranking them, let me know down below what other directors you might like to see. I have some in the works, maybe a few other directors with some big films that either just came out or are coming out that I'm going to cover here on the channel. But if you have any suggestions, please let me know down below. Or if you hated it, let me know down below. Just be respectful about it. I wanted to also thank these folks who helped donate as part of our 24-hour subathon in February. Their names will be featured on every review, ranking video till the end of the year. And I am very appreciative of all they do for the channel and for all the emotional support, obviously, and of course for their monetary support and just for being subscribers and just watching these videos. Your help does not go unnoticed, and I'm so appreciative of it. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.